Hello, BookTube. Well, it's Tuesday, and that means Tag Tuesday here on BookTube, where we do tags. I've been tagged in a few things that I have not got to yet, but I saw a tag that I really wanted to do. The original was on Aaron Facer's channel. I'll leave a link to his channel down below. He did something called the Western Canon book tag. And it naturally struck my fancy because I love to talk about the Western Canon. I've loved to teach it many, many times. And I did a series on this channel years ago called the Western Canon Starter Kit, in which I not only talk about a handful of the books on the Western Canon, but also encourage you from start to finish in that series that this is not the precinct of school. Does not require specialized training at all. You can read the Western Canon and make it your own in comparatively little time. No matter what. You do not need a professor to do this. These books were made to be read and enjoyed. And the main prompt in Aaron's tag was just name 10 or 20 books that you think belong on the Western Canon, that you think are worth talking about in that way. He doesn't make it in any way political, and neither will I. The Western Canon as we know it is absolutely doomed. Your little children, when they get to college, will not be taught the Western Canon. Not a single thing that's on it, and that's been on it for 200 years. To their great loss. But there'll always be YouTube. They can always find it that way. But in the meantime, in a handful of places where it hasn't been picketed right off the curriculum, it does still exist. And I have a list on the iPad mini here of items that I want to leave. I believe I went above 20 books. And this list is, I'll go through it as briefly as I can. And I'm including not only the works, but translations that I can recommend, because, of course, in the Western Canon, the bulk of it up until 1,000 years ago will be in other languages, and most people, especially in America, are monoglot, so they won't be able to read them in those languages. They will be relying on translators. So I have a list of books to recommend and also translators to recommend, although keep in mind, my standard piece of advice, the best approach for the question, which translation, once you determine whether or not the translator is including everything, right? If a translation is notorious because the translator changed what was in the book, drastically changed it, changed plot points, omitted things, abbreviated things, well, you want to avoid that, probably. But if it's a complete unabridged translation and you have 6 or 7 people to choose from, 6 or 7 different translations, my strong advice is always, no matter what the book is, go to the library or a bookstore and line up as many translations as you can find of the same thing. Pick one small passage and read that same passage in all of those translations. And pick the one that you liked reading the most. That's the simplest way to do this here. Never mind the technical qualifications or the prioritizing that a specialist would do. You're going to have to live with this translator for hundreds of pages. So pick the one you like the most. But I can at least vouch that the translations that I'm mentioning on this list are good. And we will start off with Homer. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey here. I'm going to recommend them both in the Robert Fitzgerald translation, which I think captures a lot of the beauty of Homer. Although the Robert Fagel's translation captures a lot of beauty too, and those books come with long, indispensably great introductions by Bernard Knox that really do get you totally up to speed with the book in a way that maybe even Wikipedia does not. So the Fitzgerald book translations don't have those introductions. The Fagels do. It, again, will be up to you. Then, of course, if we're dealing with Homer, then we will deal with Hesiod as well, the Theogony and the Works and Days. And for this, I wanted to recommend the translation of M.L. West. And then as long as we're in the ancient world, we can stick with the ancient world for a while here. We'll talk about Herodotus. For Herodotus, I want to recommend the translation by Aubrey de Selincourt, even though there are technically more precisely word-by-word, linearly accurate translations. I still think his has the highest chance of making you realize what it is about Herodotus that makes him special. And if you're going to mention Herodotus, you have to mention Thucydides. Here, I'm not as big a fan of Thucydides as I am of Herodotus, but he belongs on the canon. And here I would recommend the Rex Warner translation, although there are other translations that are more popular now. There are certainly more recent translations, and no translator can really make Thucydides as interesting as Herodotus. So again, you're just going to have to deal with what it looks to you like on the page. Then we can move for a bit to ancient Greek drama. A central place in the Western canon is ancient Greek drama. And we'll start with Aeschylus. We do his Oresteia, a trilogy, the kind of thing that you would once have gone to in the morning, got great seats, and just watched the whole thing all day. We only have, there was a standard form for ancient Greek theater. We only have one of them. And fortunately, it's a great one, but we don't know how many are greater. How many trilogies did Aeschylus himself write that were greater? But here, I will once again recommend the Robert Fagel's translation. It's really, really good. Then we have Sophocles, and for here we'll read the Theban plays. His three plays, the three plays of his that survive involving Oedipus, including Oedipus Rex, which was widely characterized in the ancient world as the greatest, the perfect drama. They are not a trilogy, but because they weren't part of a unified work, but it still very much pays you to read them at the same time. And here I want to recommend the Francis Storr translation, although, again, stick with the translator that you like. Then, after Sophocles, we can pick Euripides. Here I picked the John Davy translation of just anything. Pick 3 or 4 Euripides plays and read them. And you'll see, especially if you read them in conjunction with Aeschylus and Sophocles, you'll see a change. You'll see that ancient Greek theater was evolving into something much closer to our modern day. And the last of the dramatists would be Aristophanes. And here, since I don't believe that humor really communicates over the eons, much less even over centuries, a little of Aristophanes always goes a long way for me. So I would recommend just Lysistrata in a translation by Donald Sutherland. Then, unfortunately, we have to deal with philosophy as well. When you're talking about the Western canon, you are in large part talking about the huge effect that it's had on all the literature that comes after it. So we have to talk about Plato and Aristotle, at least. They're not the only philosophers on this list, but for Plato, I would recommend W.H.D. Rouse. I would not recommend the Jowett translation. I would recommend Rouse, who comes later, a generation later, and is significantly more eloquent and more readable, significantly closer to the weird kind of elephantine eloquence of Plato himself. And then for Aristotle, I would recommend the Richard McKeon volume that he did for Modern Library, which is a paperback. I believe it's still in print. A lovely thing. And really, Aristotle wrote a lot, and you can read a lot, but that volume will do you just fine as an introduction to Aristotle. The key here, with all of these things, not the ones we've mentioned and also everything that we're going to mention, isn't so much notching them on your belt as coming to know them. The whole point of the Western canon, despite its formidable reputation as being joyless, is that you want to revisit these works until you're familiar with them, until you know them. And I think you will want to do that with almost everything on this list, even Plato and Aristotle. But anyway, where are we here? Oh yes, you thought I wasn't going to mention it, but of course I am. And of course I'm going to mention the Bible. There is no more influential work of literature in the history of the world. So, of course, I'm going to mention the Bible here. And I'm going to say the King James Version. But the King James Version, like I've mentioned in the past on this channel, it's lovely. But it introduces an extra element of strain. The Bible is strange enough on its own. Then you get not only that, but you get a translation that time has rendered strange. It's centuries old now. So I'd also recommend the New American Standard Version of the Bible as well, which at least removes the strangeness of the translation and puts you up face to face with the strangeness of the work. But again, it's not just making your way through it. You got to know it. Anyway, then we move on. Let's see. We'll do some dramatists. We can do Plato and Terence, who are two dramatists who belong in the canon because, despite the reverence that is paid to Greek drama, they had more influence in the form of what we now consider to be drama than the Greeks did, by far. So for Terence, I would recommend Betty Radis, her translation. It's a little old, but very good, very spirited. And for Plautus, Eric Siegel, who not only translated Plautus, but also wrote about him really well. Then we can do a block of historians. Let's do a block of historians. For instance, Xenophon, second-tier author from the ancient world, but immensely worth reading. And for Xenophon, I want to recommend again Rex Warner, who was a kind of a prolific translator of his day and really good. he's really he writes really enjoyable stuff, I think. Then Polybius, the Punic Wars. For him, I would mention the translator Robin Waterfield, who does a great job, just a great job. Feels a little disloyal to say that because I've spent decades with the Penguin translation, who is not Robin Waterfield, but Waterfield does a better job. So, again, I'm talking in terms of, dispensing with translator tics, looking at the text afresh, that sort of thing. I am not talking about prescriptive measures at all here. If you read the Robin Waterfield translation and some other translation, you like the other translation better, go with that. Like I said, you're going to be living with the translator for a long time. It's good that you get along with him. Then another historian would be the Roman historian Livy. And for this, I would recommend the translation of one volume from Penguin by Aubrey de Selincourt, which is a sentimental favorite of mine. Then, as far as if we keep going with historians, I would recommend the Annals of Tacitus, translated by Alfred Church, and the Histories of Tacitus, the Church translation of the Histories. And then Donald Dudley did a translation of the Annals, the two works of Tacitus that you have to read, the Annals and the History. Donald Dudley did a translation of the Annals. I don't know if it's still in print, but it's really good. Really captures the bite of Tacitus. He's such a brilliant writer to read. Not just a stodgy historian, just there's bite in every single section of his book. And Dudley captures that really well. Then, in terms of historians here, we will talk about one of my favorites, which is Plutarch. Wrote an enormous work called The Parallel Lives, that I've mentioned many times on this channel has not been treated well by English translating tradition. The version that you are far more likely to see than any else was overseen by the poet John Dryden. He did an unabridged translation, which includes not only all the lives of the famous Greeks and the lives of the famous Romans, but all the comparison lives that Plutarch wrote as well, and includes them in the order, in the placement that Plutarch more or less wanted. That's the way that you should read this book. It's a big book. It's a huge undertaking to do, but it's not, in my opinion, a good idea to read a handful of plucked lives from the work. You should read the whole thing. And the Dryden translation is really good. Unfortunately, it's almost the only game in town, and it presents the same problem as the King James Bible. Dryden's English is the English of a different era, but it's more accessible than the King James. It will work. It is still readable. Then, unfortunately, another work of history, the De Rerum Natura of Lucretius, on the nature of things, on the nature of the universe. Here, the Frank Copley translation is the one that I would recommend as making the most sense that can be made. The codswallop that is Lucretius, still really influential. And in terms of influence, we can then move on to more Romans. For instance, the 12 Caesars of Suetonius, a collection of short biographies of the men who ruled the Roman world. And the translation here that you're most likely to encounter is also a winner, and that is Robert Graves. If your library, for instance, is small, it might have only one translation of Suetonius, if it has Suetonius at all, and that is almost certainly going to be the Robert Graves translation. It's not a bad one. In addition to Suetonius, we should deal with Cicero, who wrote a lot. He was unbelievably prolific. We have a huge number of his letters. We have transcriptions of the speeches that he gave in his court cases. And we also have his Cod Philosophy, his big works of philosophy. I would say read it all. Cicero was tremendously influential on the centuries that followed the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And here, the popular historian Michael Grant, sort of a successor to W.H.D. Rouse or Rex Warner, I would recommend. Michael Grant's translations of as much Cicero as you can stand would be good. Then, when we're talking about significant here, one of the weirdest significances in the world is the fact that we have so much writing from Julius Caesar, who was also a pivotal figure in history. That's kind of amazing. You really wish in like the pre-Renaissance days, you really wish you had that for a lot of people, and you don't. And for Julius Caesar, there is one volume. I unfortunately think that it might be really expensive now. But the landmark Julius Caesar, Bob Strasser did a series of books called The Landmark So-and-so. There's a Landmark Thucydides, there's a Landmark Herodotus, there's a Landmark Xenophon. And he did a landmark Julius Caesar that is amazing. It is an amazing volume. It's fresh new translations of everything that Caesar had published under his own name. Tons and tons of maps, tons of appendices about all aspects of Caesar's world. Last time I checked, I think someone told me that it was obscenely expensive to buy in the secondhand market and appears not to be in print anymore. If that's true, don't kill yourself, but see if your library has a copy. Then let's deal with a few more Romans. For instance, Juvenal, the satirist Juvenal. Doesn't take long, won't take you more than a day to read everything that Juvenal wrote that we still have. I would recommend the translations by the classicist Peter Green. Then the poet Catullus, the Roman poet Catullus. Not entirely translatable. Of course, when you're dealing with poems, when you're dealing with poetry, the troubles of translating get worse, much worse. You're not missing, in a competent translation, you're not missing much with Thucydides. Maybe 5 or 10%. With a poet, that number goes way up, and there's no way to avoid that unless you enlist a poet to do the translating who's every bit as talented as the poet he's translating, and that's asking a lot. So that is not the case in any of this case. For Juvenal, I want to recommend, again, Peter Green. The classicist Peter Green. For Catullus, I would recommend Peter Wigham. But again, you want to go with whatever. A million people have translated Catullus, so go with whoever you like, whoever approach you like. But I could recommend Peter Wigham, and for my beloved Horace, Neil Rudd. Horace is a perfect example of how it pays to read a lot of poets, translating him to see what kind of approach you like. But and then just a couple more Roman poets, the big ones. There is Virgil. You have to read his masterpiece, the Aeneid. Here I would recommend Alan Mandelbaum's translation. And Ovid, the Roman poet Ovid, his book, The Metamorphoses. Here I would recommend Horace Gregory, who was a very talented poet. So I think that might be why his translation of The Metamorphoses is still my favorite, even though it's 60, 70 years old. I think you will like it more than later translations. Then we take a little bit of a jump to St. Augustine. And St. Augustine wrote 2 masterpieces. He wrote The City of God, which is an enormous work of theology. And he wrote a shorter, more personal work called The Confessions. The Confessions you absolutely have to read. It's an utterly remarkable work, really the beginning of something new in Western letters. And here, the translation that I want to recommend is fairly recent. You can probably still get it at your bookstore. It's by Sarah Ruden, Ruden, and it's really, really good. The first woman to translate the Confessions for a popular audience and a publisher, I think, ever. Then we can move to Beowulf, which is it's not as influential an epic as a lot of people would like to think, although it had a huge influence on the whole subgenre of fantasy. But for this, I want to recommend Seamus Heaney's amazing revoicing of Beowulf. Just an astonishing translation feat, and readily available in the used book market, online, in your bookstore, in your library. The Seamus Heaney Beowulf is everywhere, so that one at least I don't have to worry about. Then a block of Italians, thanks to the long shadow cast back into the past by the Italian Renaissance. The Italians sort of took over literature for a while, so we have Dante. And there have been many talented translators of Dante. You have to read the Divine Comedy. You should read the Vita Nuova as well, but the Divine Comedy is necessary to read. Fortunately, you have the ultimate help in doing that, because you have a canto-by-canto guide by booktuber Tom at Tom L.A. Books. Simply go to his channel. I'm sure there's a playlist, and guide your way through every canto of the Divine Comedy. Could not make it any easier. There are many translators. For Dante, I'm going to recommend my homeboy, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He might not be to your taste. Again, just check many translations. Then the next Italian is Petrarch, the great poet, and I would recommend David Young for an English translation. And then Machiavelli, Niccolo Machiavelli, the author of The Prince. You have to read The Prince. It won't take you long at all. But the thing about these things, aside from massive doorstops like The Parallel Lives, is not so much how long it will take you, but that you need to reread it. You need to revisit these things until you know them. And for The Prince, a lot like Thucydides, you're not going to be missing much, no matter who does the work. I recommend Luigi Ricci as a translator, but any translator will probably work fairly well. And then Boccaccio, the Decameron. Big, gigantic stories that are totally unsuitable for a 21st century censorious morality, but that had a huge impact on the world of literature, and that are a lot of fun to read if you just get over yourself and don't pay attention to blue check marks on Twitter. And I would recommend the Wayne Rebhorn translation in the paperback, which has a very nice blurb. Always want to go with good blurbs if you can get them. Then also Don Quixote by Cervantes. The Edith Grossman translation is hands down the best translation. I've read 6 translations of this book. It's hands down the best one. So I recommend that one. And like the Seamus Heaney Beowulf, that was also something of a translating phenomenon. And so I believe is still in print. It will be in your bookstore. It will certainly be in your library. Then we come to Geoffrey Chaucer. Here you want to read the Canterbury Tales. It's no use me saying that Troilus and Cressida is better. The Canterbury Tales is the book of his that has the most influence. You definitely want to read that. And this has come up on this channel before. There are 2 ways to read Chaucer. You can either read Chaucer, or you can read someone's modernized English version of Chaucer. No shame either way. It is possible to read Chaucer and get to know him. But if not, the standard modernized version is by Neville Coghill for Penguin Classics. There are 80 million copies in print of that, so it won't be hard for you to find. Then the next one you want to read is Les Mots d'Arthur by Thomas Malory. The sort of syncretization, the sort of pulling together and popularization of Arthurian mythos. And here there is a Norton critical edition of the Les Mots d'Arthur that is great, fantastic. So just go for that. Go to the used book market and find the old Norton critical of The Death of Arthur, of Les Mots d'Arthur, and get that. Then Christopher Marlowe, who started something new on the English stage. Simple as that. And was a marvel. He was a 10-day wonder for it. So you have to read the complete plays and the complete poems of Marlowe. They do not require much in the way of explication. Notes will always tell you more of what was on Marlowe's mind. He was a very elusive, very classically trained poet, so there's a ton of stuff there, but you don't need it, especially with the plays, to get the strength of what you're seeing. So all of Marlowe in any edition that you want. Another work that is enormously influential, but it's another doorstop, and it is an undertaking, is The Faerie Queene by Edmund Spenser. Penguin Classics used to make, I don't know if they still do, a big unabridged brick of a paperback. There's no sense reading bits and pieces of The Faerie Queene. Once you get used to its weird pacing and diction, it won't be so off-putting, and then you can read it all, and you really should, because, oh boy, every literary person for 2 centuries that came after it read it all and knew it backwards and forwards. Since we're talking about poetry here, we talk about John Donne. He was an extreme brain-bending poet, but well worth reading. Essential to read for the poetic tradition that follows him for centuries. And there's a critical edition. Donne it's very helpful to read him in a critical edition. A long introduction, lots of notes on every poem, lots of endnotes, lots and lots of secondary stuff to help you. And John Shawcross did a critical edition of the complete Donne. I don't think it's still in print, but it's terrific. So if you can find a cheap copy of the John Shawcross version of John Donne, fine. But otherwise, any collected John Donne, even if it doesn't have notes, even if it's just the poems, you're still going to be introduced to a weirdly great mind. And believe it or not, we're going to wrap up this Western Canon book tag here with one last suggestion. We are not moving any further than the English Renaissance. So there could be a part 2, but a part 2 wouldn't need translators for most of it. And we're finishing up right where you'd expect that we would, with William Shakespeare, who you need to read. The plays and the poems. You need to read these things, and you need to read them well. You need to know them. You need, when it comes to the 10 of the plays and maybe 10 of the sonnets, you need to know them. You don't need to just run your eyes over them and have no recall of them. They're part of your literary patrimony. They're an intense part of it. They're the greatest part of it. So you really need to, it's not a question of just reading Macbeth. You need to know Macbeth. And for this, I would recommend a book that is out of print. The Riverside Shakespeare is still very much in print. But you want to stay away from the modern Riverside editions. You want to stick with the second edition Riverside, the big brown book. It's big and brown. There are many, many, many copies out there. I'm sure that you can find a copy secondhand on eBay or on Amazon. Just be very careful to pin down the seller of that second edition big brown Riverside Shakespeare. Be very careful to pin down the seller in terms of specifics about the book, because this was a textbook. Students have learned this for 2 generations, which means there are very few copies of that second generation Riverside Shakespeare that don't have obnoxious neon highlighting. You want to be very careful of that. If the seller of that edition on eBay says the book may have highlighting, send them a message. Before you pay, send them a message and say, may doesn't help me. I want you to tell me with your own eyes that this doesn't have highlighting. And if they won't do it, then don't buy it. Wait to make sure that you get a clean copy. They are out there. I find them from time to time, so they are out there. But anyway, that is the Western Canon book tag, maybe part 1 of the Western Canon and some suggested translators. So I'll leave a link to Aaron's video down below. I could go on about the Western Canon until the very crack of doom. I will not do that. So I'll wrap this up for now. But I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.